guys, happy May. We are a couple of days away from Mother's Day. I put out a little menu of what I would normally serve. I normally have my huge family over. We have so many mothers to celebrate. I thought it would be really nice to show you guys some of the things I normally serve. I almost always serve scones. Scones are kind of a family specialty for me. I always serve crepes. We're slowly having a love affair with crepes. They're both really easy to do. The first thing I'm gonna do in this video is show you guys how to make a little compote. This rhubarb came from my sister's garden last year, and I'm gonna turn it into a rhubarb and vanilla compote. When you get some fruit for a compote, you have to really assess what fruit that you've got. This fruit here is quite tart. Not only tart, it can be bitter if it's not cooked properly. So I would always look at doubling the amount with sugar, only like taking it away. So something like strawberries, they're already sweet. I would probably do half the amount of strawberries of sugar. Something like rhubarb, they're not sweet at all. I'd want to go more sugar, but I still don't want to double it. I'm not making a preserve, I'm not making a jam, I'm making a compote. You need the sugar in order for the compote to cook properly. The sugar is part of that texture that you get at the end. It's very important that you use it. As much as you want to skimp, there's no skimping. So for rhubarb, I'm gonna go just under the equal amount. I'm gonna hope for 3/4 of the amount. I'm just gonna eyeball it here. So let me get some sugar in here, and I'll just, that, a little bit more. That's probably just about 3/4 the amount of rhubarb of sugar. And because my family likes to add flavor where we can, I'm gonna add a little bit of my homemade vanilla to it. Quite often I'll even add vanilla beans, which are really nice. This is really gonna flavor it, and it's gonna give it a great balance. I'm gonna throw this on the stove and let it go about a medium low the entire time I'm cooking other things. Then when I'm done, this is done and everything's together. So I'll just get this on the stove right now. All right, my compote is going, and next I'm gonna put together some scones. My recipe, at least, is super easy. Scones are one of those things that people think need a lot of effort, but you really don't. All you need at the end of the day is a proper texture. Anything else you put in there is kind of up to you. So I'm gonna make a plain scone mix, and I'll turn it into plain scones, and I'll also turn it into some raspberry scones, and I'll show you how easy it is to add and alter things to your scones. So my scone recipe is 300 grams of bread flour, 300 grams of pastry flour, 1.25 grams of salt, 30 grams of sugar, and 40 grams of baking powder. I do recommend getting a scale. If you're not a mother, get this for your mother. They're incredibly inexpensive. Baked goods need to be weighed. They shouldn't be volume. They can be, and they'll kind of work, but baking recipes are actually a scientific formula, and you need a scale to get the appropriate outcome of your formula. I know the recipe calls for bread flour and pastry flour. I understand not every family has several types of flours. I do, but no worries about it. I'm actually going to use just all-purpose flour. This flour is an unbleached white from Anita's Organic. A couple of mothers there would be Jada, and it would be Julie, and they're both also celebrating Mother's Day, so I thought I'd mention that this is coming from Anita's Organic. It's a local company with a couple of amazing mothers working there. So I just have 600 grams of all-purpose flour. I'm going to put it on my scale and make sure my scale is at 0. Now I'm gonna start adding my ingredients. So 12.5 grams of salt, and then it is 40 grams of baking powder, 30 grams of sugar. What I would do next is mix them up. They're really well combined, and I don't have like a clump of baking powder or a little pile of salt in one corner. I want it well mixed. All right, so this is just about mixed here. Next, we have 200 grams of salted butter. What I've done with the butter is I've broken it up into smaller pieces already. If I just do chunks of butter, I'm only hurting myself in the end. I'm gonna put it in the scone, and I'm gonna break it up into the size of peas. So let's get our 200 grams of butter. And we're just gonna very carefully break it in. This is a pastry blender, so this is just about together. Okay. This is looking pretty good to me. I don't have massive pieces of butter. I don't have tiny pieces of butter. One thing I like to do is just run my hand through it and make sure I didn't miss anything. If I miss something, I'll just break it up a little bit with my fingers. Why do I want it a little chunky? I want the butter to be the size of peas because the steam released when the butter melts is part of the leavening. So this recipe has 2 leavening agents. The first one would be the baking powder, and it does really well. But the second one would be the steam, and that helps with the initial lift. As soon as it melts, comes up, and it's absolutely beautiful. So at this stage, this is where you want to start changing things. Unless you're adding ultimate dry things like spices, you can add your spices in with your flour. But if you want to turn it into a pumpkin scone, this is the stage when you would add your pumpkin puree. If you want to turn it into a raspberry scone, which I do, this is the stage where I'm going to turn it into a raspberry scone. So what I would do is I'll just take some of this away. It's well mixed, I'm not worried about it. And I'll do about that much for raspberry scones. And then I'm going to grab my raspberries and throw them in. Put my raspberries in here. And from here, I'll very gently mix them in. So the entire recipe, so that's these 2 combined, calls for 390 grams of milk. Milk, depending on the fat content of your milk, you could probably just weigh that out in mils. The higher the fat, the farther away it gets from true cross weight and volume. Like water weight and volume is the same, but like a skim milk's pretty close, so 1% is pretty close. It's not that far off. I did weigh mine though, because I've got a scale, I might as well use it. So what I want to do and how I'm going to make my milk last for both is I'm just going to add some in until it looks together. So when it looks together, it needs to be rollable, but it can't be overmixed. Some of my milk into this guy, and let's see how it looks. You do want to knead a little bit, but not too much when you're making scones. The less you work with it, the flakier product you'll have, like the fluffier, risier product you'll have. The more you work with it, the harder it is. So I added a splash more milk, and now it's feeling just slightly wet, so I'm going to add a little bit more of this plain mixture to it. So there is raspberry scones. Plain recipe, threw some things in there, and I did everything the exact same, raspberry scones. So I'm going to put this aside while I mix my plain scones, and then I'll roll them out and I'll show you how I plan on cutting them. And let's add milk just till combined to the rest of it. One thing I do, especially with scones, is I just make it until it looks right, and I don't stress. So I'll get the amount measured, and then if I need a little more, I'll use a little more. If I need a little less, I'll use a little less. Either way, I'm pretty chill about it. It looks like I'm gonna throw this whole thing in, make sure it's all together to roll. It absolutely is. Awesome. So I'll grab my rolling pin, a sheet pan, and I'll get these rolled out, and I'll show you how I'm gonna put them together. All right, I've got my pan ready. I've got a little bit of flour to roll out. I'm gonna put my scones together. So we just wanna brush our bench a little bit. That's what you would call your counter. You put your just mixed scone on there. You just make sure you've got a good amount of flour on both sides. So when you're rolling out, you wanna roll in 2 directions. The reason is a batter or a dough or whatever you're making is always going to want to shrink up in itself. If you're only rolling lengthwise, it's only going to shrink lengthwise. If you're rolling in all directions, it's going to shrink from all directions, and you're going to retain your shape, which is great. So I want this not too thin, not too thick. I want this just over 1 centimeter thick, I think, or around 1 centimeter thick. Remember, we've got 2 leaveners in there, so I'm not too worried about it not rising to be really, really big. I just don't want it to be too big. So if I keep it really thick, it's gonna be insane. I'll just cut these with a cutter. If you guys don't have cutters, you could cut them in squares, or you could make a big circle and just cut it with a knife. Literally, you can do anything. What I really like to do when I am working in industry is I just make them look really rustic. And what that means is I just grab a handful and I throw it on my pan. That's all I do. They look amazing when you do that, and they're kind of like coffee house style. I can comfortably re-roll this one more time, and I can uncomfortably roll it as many times as I want. So I'm positive that me re-rolling it once would have the same effect on my scones, and I'm pretty darn sure if I roll it a couple times, it'll be okay. It just won't be as nice. You just don't want to have all of this excess flour in there. So you pick it up, tap it off, just bring it together gently. You want to bring it together, you want to be firm enough that it's actually sticking to itself, but you don't want to be so rough that you're melting the fat inside of your batter, and you don't want to be so rough that you're over mixing the actual ingredients. And then with this little bit here, I'm just gonna tap it all off and just shove it in my ring. So I've got a somewhat similar shaped scone. So these are my plain scones. I'll get back to them and show you what I'm gonna do next. But first, let's roll out my raspberry scones. So same thing. I've got one little trick for you. If you guys are going to be doing two similar things, but one is messier than the other, I always, always, always do my messy one second. That way I don't have to doubly do duty. I don't have to clean in between because I just did plain scones and now I'm doing raspberry scones. Mix those two together, it's no big deal. If I did raspberry scones first and then my plain scones, then I would have very, very messy plain scones, or I'd have to stop what I was doing and completely clean my station. Okay, so this is well floured. This one with the raspberries in there is a little more delicate, so I'm gonna be careful with rolling. You see the raspberries are coming onto my rolling pin. He's about just over 1 centimeter, and let me start cutting him. Okay, so same thing, even though these are messier and harder to work with, I still wanna get as much flour off as possible when I do my re-roll. That's my oven. My oven is now hot. I set it to 340 degrees. And this guy I'm just gonna turn into one of those coffee house style scones I was telling you about. All right, I'll clean this up and then I'll finish my scones and get them in. Okay, there's a few different things I can do to finish these scones and get them ready for the oven. So I could brush with butter and it'd be this amazing little caramelizing color, only kind of matte. Or I like to brush them with heavy cream and put a little bit of sugar on top. I think that's a really great way to finish these. What I'm gonna do with these ones in particular is I am actually going to brush them with an egg wash. What that is gonna do is they're gonna get an amazing color, but they're also gonna get this really awesome sheen that is kind of really professional looking. So I'm only gonna do a few at a time, and then I'm gonna do a really thick sugar crust on them. I know I mention it all the time how much I like a good sugar crust. I think it really, really adds a lot to a baked good. And same as with rolling, I'm starting with my plain scones before I go to my raspberry scones, because I don't wanna get raspberry on my plain scones, but I don't care if I get plain on my raspberry scones. All right, I'm gonna get these in the oven. They'll be in for somewhere around 18 minutes, but again, that depends on your oven, depends on your hot spots, depends on everything that you do, depends on if you flip them. So I'm actually gonna flip these so they get evenly cooked. I'm gonna time for 10, turn them around, and then I'll have an idea of how much is left. I'll show you what they're supposed to look like and feel like when they're done as well. While my scones are in the oven, I'm gonna show you how to make a really easy crepe batter. I had to rack my brain to write this recipe out because I usually just eyeball it. What a crepe batter basically is an eggy, milky sort of thing with a little bit of flour in it. I always finish mine with a melted butter. Sometimes I add sugar, sometimes I don't. So I got 4 eggs here. These 4 eggs, I'm gonna add a cup of milk. I'm gonna add a pinch of salt and a little bit of sugar. I just like it, sorry. Not too much. I wouldn't do much more than 50 grams if you're gonna measure it. The sugar's gonna affect how it cooks. So that's just my egg and that's my milk. And now I'm gonna slowly add flour. In the recipe I gave out, it said 200 grams of flour. So I'm gonna slowly add my flour until I think the texture looks good. It definitely won't be more than 200 grams. That's just over a cup. It's like a heaping cup. Because I like flavor, I'm gonna add my boozy vanilla to it. Some is my measurement. But if I had to say tablespoon, I'm gonna slowly add some flour. Oh no, it's so lumpy. What am I gonna do? Well, I have a plan. I have a plan. I always add melted butter to my crepe batter, but I also mix it up with an immersion blender. So an immersion blender is just one of these little electric guys that needs to be immersed the entire time it's working. And it helps break up all of the lumps of flour and well incorporate all of my melted butter. So I have about 4 tablespoons of melted butter, and I'll have it going on low, and I'll add my butter as it's going. I always check my texture of crepe batter on the outside of my thing. I want it to be quite thin, but I want it to hold its hold a line when I put a line in there. And then, yep, it's holding a line, looks good to me. And I'm gonna let this rest for at least 10 minutes. You could let it rest overnight, but 10 minutes is fine. I usually take this time to start setting up platters and get ready for when people come over. So I'm gonna do a little bit of setup, and then I'll show you guys how to bake them, and then afterwards I'll show you all the stuff I made. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is attempt to cook my crepes. Quite often I'll sacrifice my first one to the crepe gods. I've got a very hot pan. Even though I've got a nice non-stick pan, for my first crepe, I always add a little bit of oil. And that oil helps get it off, obviously. But my next like 4 or 5 crepes, I don't add oil because there's still residual oil on the pan and I don't need to mess around with it. It's not until I have problems lifting it off again do I need to add a little bit. So my well-rested batter, I've got about a 6-ounce ladle. I'll do just under 6 ounces for this guy. And then I'll spread them around my pan. So I'm gonna leave him, so I had it on high to heat up, turned it down to medium. I'm gonna leave him until I start to see a little bit of color on the outsides and the inside starts to look dry. When the inside starts to look dry, then I can flip it. I'm one of the few who can just flip a pan, but not everyone is, so I'm just gonna show you a really easy way to flip it where you don't have to stress out about it, because that's the problem. And when people make crepes is they stress about how am I gonna flip it, it's so flimsy, it's not a pancake. Yeah, it is flimsy, but it's not impossible. Okay, so it's starting to be dry on the top and I'm starting to see some color right there. So let me just make sure it's released. I go straight to the middle and I just give it a flip. Easy. And then it only needs a few seconds on the second side. We just want to make sure all of that stuff that was drying out is just a little bit cooked, but it's nice, it's thin, we actually don't need that much. Let's spread that bad boy around. Cook it till the outside starts to brown, the inside looks dry, flip it. So easy. All right, outsides are starting to brown, inside looks dry. Make sure I'm well in the middle, flip it. Just shift back down. Sorry, just under 6 ounces. Spread that bad boy around. I'll finish these off and I'll show you when they're all done. Happy Mother's Day to everybody. A couple of things I wanted to show you. When a scone is done, it is a little brown on the bottom and it is lighter than it looks. So I've got all these amazing layers on it. The thicker you roll it, the thicker the scone that you get. The compote is done. So it is rhubarb, less sugar than the rhubarb, but close to, and a little bit of vanilla. My crepes are done. It is a very consistent batter. If you guys follow the recipe, the batter will almost always work. And then just to show, so I would have a whole counter full of food for my family, all of the mothers that I love. I would have scones, I would have crepes, I'd have compotes, I'd have whipped creams, I'd have scrambled eggs, I'd have all sorts of meats like bacon, sausages, and farmer sausage. I'd probably have a fruit platter, I'd have veggies and dip. I'd have lots for them because I love them so much. But happy Mother's Day and happy testing out recipes. Thank you.